What I thought we were going to do, just to start out, get initial insights from each of our bishops here about where we are and how we can work better collaboratively as a church. So maybe we'll. So we have Auxiliary Bishop of Orange, Timothy Freyer, and we have Bishop Lopes from the Ordinariate, and we have Bishop Morlino, who's been here every year since the beginning of the Napa Institute from Madison, and right next to me, our Archbishop Coakley of Oklahoma City. Bishop Freyer, would you mind beginning us? California-born native, been here all your life. I figure you're most at home here.
Thank you.
Maybe you can begin.
Thanks, Kathryn. To me, I think that we're at a time in which there's a great opportunity to share the good news of Humanae Vitae. My experience working with young adults is that they're now at the point of really being open to something different. They've grown up in a society in which they've seen heartbreak. They grew up seeing their parents divorce. They've seen their relationships fall apart. They've tried the hookup culture. They've tried drinking. They've tried drugs. And they're desperate for anything, I think, that will give them a sense of meaning, a sense of value, a sense of life. And so my experience has been, once they get to know you and trust you, as you've been hearing throughout the course of the day, that they will listen carefully to the message of Humanae Vitae. I was at one of our universities speaking with the Catholic students there, and they're going around praying before class, and they're talking about God, and I said, "You're in a secular university. Do you get any resistance whatsoever?" And they say no, because they're so desperate for something, they're willing to try even religion again. They're willing to try something again. These things that seem outlandish to them, like praying and faith and chastity, actually are starting to get some traction among our young adults. In marriage preparation, after a number of sessions of speaking with them, I would begin to talk about moral issues with them. And I would say things like, if I could give you a vaccine that would almost guarantee that you won't go through the heartbreak of divorce, would you like that? And they're on the edge of their seat. They want to know what it is. And then I tell them that you could choose to practice like many married couples and contracept, or you can follow the teaching of the church, and instead of having a 1 in 2 divorce rate, you'll have about a 1 in 50 divorce rate. Wouldn't you want to avoid that? Here's a simple way. And then we start talking about their meals, and we've talked about where they've gone on their dates over the course of these months, and they're very big into making sure that they have organic, free-range chicken and all of these different things. And so I say, isn't that great that you're taking care of your body? But why are you flooding your body with hormones that can cause stroke and breast cancer and these things that they hadn't heard of? And so just approaching it on what's in it for me, there's a great receptivity. And then to be able to talk to them about the prophecies that are contained in Humanae Vitae, that St. Paul VI was truly a wise man to say, if we take this path, these were the consequences. Lack of respect for women. We see that in the Me Too movement. We see an increase in divorce. He hit about that. We see how larger companies, more wealthy companies, pressure younger countries and poorer countries to use contraception in return to receiving financial aid. That his prophecies have all come through. And so once we start speaking of that and the injustices that happen, that resonates with young people as well. They find themselves not wanting to have our government oppressed through manipulation and sterilization and forcing people. Are there challenges? Yes. Talking with couples that live as the church commands, they speak of at the grocery store the weird looks when they have 4 children and 5 children, and the people are saying, so they're all yours? And yes, they're all ours, and hopefully we'll have another one coming, and it's like they have 15 heads coming out, but they've gotten used to that. My couples experience a sense of humor and joy as they experience that, but there's a fear from some of our couples. There's also a fear among a lot of our priests to preach what the church teaches. And because they're afraid that people won't like it, that people will say, I'm not going to come to your church anymore, that how can you be so judgmental? And yet, my experience, especially this past year, I've been preaching about this in a variety of parishes as we're celebrating the 50th anniversary, and I've spoken of the prophecies. I've spoken and preached about this to thousands of people. Not one person has come up with a complaint about my preaching on Humanae Vitae. Every single person has come up, if they've had a comment, it's been, thank you. This is what we needed to hear. I wish my kids were here to hear this. So I've been trying to get our priests to be bold, to say, if you preach the truth with love, people will respond. They'll react to it. I think we just need to pray that our priests will take the words of St. John Paul II, which is echoing Jesus. Do not be afraid. Preach the truth with love. Once people get to know you, you speak that truth with love, they'll respond. I think we have an opportunity now with this society who are desperate for something different, who see that what their parents taught them isn't working, and they're willing to try to be obedient to God's command and will indeed be joyful prophets of the good news of life.
Thank you. Bishop Lopes?
I have the pleasure of serving as the Bishop of the Ordinariate of the Chair of St. Peter, the thing with a long name no one's ever heard of. My diocese spans most of North America, and it is comprised of formerly Anglican and Episcopal parishes who have become Catholic. We have 74 priests in the diocese. I'm born and raised a Catholic, which makes me the only cleric in the diocese that actually started out this way. All of my priests and our deacons have therefore come into full communion with the Catholic Church and have brought their communities of faith, their parish communities, into full communion with the Catholic Church. You might imagine, and I would think that one of the cultural presuppositions would be that a teaching like Humanae Vitae against artificial forms of contraception would be one of the reasons not to become a Catholic. And yet again and again and again, I have heard from my priests as they have talked to me about their own personal, intellectual, and spiritual conversions, how much they were drawn into the truth of Catholic faith precisely by what's taught in Humanae Vitae. Many of these men, as Anglicans, would have experienced outright persecution, prosecution even, by their diocesan authorities for doing things that are unthinkable, like, preaching against abortion, or daring as an Episcopal priest to mention contraception as something that should be thought about differently. They come to that fullness of understanding of the wisdom there, but because this is something interesting to me, I try to drill down with them. Well, tell me more. Put it into your words. What the church is teaching, what the beauty of truth is. And I find something very interesting in that. When I ask them to do it, they don't use the language of Humanae Vitae. They put it through the lens of the personalism of John Paul II. You see, most of them don't go and pick up Humanae Vitae and read it as the starting point. Most of them, however, have been formed by the theology of the body and the deep personalism of John Paul II that turned to the individual, that understanding of relationality as a constitutive part of what it means to be human, the dignity and vocation of women, the great richness of not only John Paul II's teaching, but his personal pastoral example. All of that is built on the foundation of Paul VI's document, Humanae Vitae. But whereas Humanae Vitae, just as an interesting curiosity, how many of you have read Humanae Vitae within the last year? I don't think we're hitting 1%, even in this kind of room. It's a dense document. It's a hard document because it is prophetic, as Bishop said, but it is prophetic precisely because it's addressing itself to scientists, it's addressing itself to educators, it's addressing itself to married couples, to bishops, priests, and catechists. It's dealing with a host of audiences, and so it's expressing truth in a prophetic way that John Paul II takes and develops and applies pastorally to the lives of people through that wonderful personalism that is the hallmark of his own theology. So, for example, when I asked my priest, so tell me about the church's teaching, what drew you in? It doesn't begin with an it, contraception. It begins with a him or a her. It begins with the person. So whereas Humanae Vitae will say something like this: with regard to the biological process, responsible parenthood means an awareness of and a respect for their proper functions. In the procreative faculty, the human mind discerns biological laws that apply to the human person. Absolutely true. But here, John Paul II and the way that we would talk about that truth now, after having experienced the great grace of his pontificate, she's not the problem. Her body is not a nuisance that's to be gotten around somehow. And her natural cycles, as it turns out, that's not an illness to be cured. It says the same thing, beginning with the person. And from that personalism, developing it into a relational sense, that in order to teach the truth of Humanae Vitae, what you're teaching is dignity, respect, and the fact that your absolute I is conformed sacramentally by grace to this other I that's sitting right next to you and your spouse, and that together you form the new creation in Christ. And so therefore there's that putting someone else, that self-sacrificial giving, all of that kind of language which is there in Humanae Vitae. As we celebrate that document and its anniversary today, we do so from the perspective of having that great rich teaching of John Paul II. So I'm a witness to the fact. I am privileged to be witness to the fact that I can point to priests and entire congregations who have sought the truth of the Catholic Church because of what we teach. So we shouldn't ever shy away from it. But if someone was going to ask me today for a primer on what the Church teaches, I don't think I'd start them with Humanae Vitae, the document. I would tell them to go read Mulieris Dignitatem, the letter of John Paul II on the dignity and vocation of women. Read that, start there, and you have an entirely different conversation than perhaps the one that you'd expect.
Thank you. Bishop Morlino?
Well, I couldn't agree more with my brother bishops. Very, very well said. Makes it a little challenging to
That's why we said it.
follow.
Yes, we planned it.
But I'm frequently confronted in the Diocese of Madison with the comment, what business do you have talking to us about contraception? And I say, very simple. I've been practicing contraception my whole life, and by the most effective method. So that takes care of that. But very much in continuity with what Bishop Lopes was just saying, I think that the fresh look at Humanae Vitae, a different perspective, a different starting point, is the key. Because the document Humanae Vitae is absolutely true, but it's not presented in a way that would be most attractive and most appealing to people. But it's absolutely true, and it's the foundation. And the predictions that Paul VI made have all come true, and in spades. But I like to approach it from the context of evangelization through beauty, and using Humanae Vitae ultimately as a tool of evangelization through beauty. Because what the vision of the human person that Humanae Vitae presents, the vision of marriage that Humanae Vitae presents is a beautiful, beautiful picture. It's a picture of that special space of one flesh unity of husband and wife, wherein the Lord himself has always wanted to play a part. It's the Lord's will that in that one flesh coming together of husband and wife, he be present so that he can create if he wants. Now, to think of that space as sacred, which it is between husband and wife, to think of that space as sacred is much helped by the notion of it's kind of a sanctuary of God's presence where he can carry out his will. And to somehow exclude God from that place where he wants to be could never be a good. It could never be a good thing. But to take it from the point of view of the beauty of the marital act, rather than something else, is, I think, very helpful. And we have to remember, we live when we do this. Why do I say evangelization through beauty? Because our culture has lost a sense of beauty. For our culture, the beautiful is whatever people like. Whatever you like is beautiful. You like Lady Gaga, that's beautiful. It's far-fetched, but that's where the culture is. That's where the culture is. So what we have to do really is help people to focus on true beauty, which always ennobles, which always calls people to something higher, never the bare minimum. We've got to focus on that beauty as it's reflected in marriage and in the marital act, a sanctuary where God himself wants to be present, where he performs one of the greatest miracles that can happen ever, the creation of new human life. It could never be right to tell the Lord that he is not welcome in that place. But rather than start there, let's start with the beauty of it all. That wonderful beauty which attracts every human heart, no matter how desensitized by the culture. No matter how desensitized by the culture. The true beauty, the beauty which ennobles, which encourages, which calls to what is higher, is always the beauty that touches the human heart. And that's why, as Bishop Freyer said so well, the young people are alive with this. We have the University of Wisconsin, Madison. There are 43,000 students. Thank God we have a wonderful campus ministry. But those young people, when they see beauty, real beauty, always respond. They're not so jaded, they're not so desensitized that they don't. And I think that's true of many, many, many more people as well, not only students. I think the real power of beauty calls for a loving response. So, thank you.
Thank you. Archbishop Coakley?
Well, I have the unenviable position of being fourth. Yeah. And,
I noticed you hated before you took this seat, and I realize now why.
at the bishops' general assemblies, when we gather every November and June, we have some extended conversations and interventions over various topics, and eventually you get to the point where you realize that everything that needs to be said has been said, but not everybody has said it yet. And
It's an understatement.
For those conference meetings.
but there's an expectation to say something. So, but at the risk of merely repeating the beautiful truths and ways of expressing those truths that my brothers have already expressed here today, personally, I came of age kind of right at that juncture between the pontificates of Paul VI and St. John Paul II, Blessed Paul VI, and St. John Paul II. I remember the day Paul VI died. It was the Feast of the Transfiguration, August 6th, 1978. I was packing my bags, heading to the seminary for the first time. I arrived at the seminary, and a month later, John Paul II had been elected after the brief pontificate of John Paul I, and a month after that, John Paul II had been elected, or rather when John Paul II was elected after the brief pontificate of John Paul I. But the point is simply that these were the two men who really formed me in a very particular way. I remember the publication 50 years ago of Humanae Vitae. I was in junior high school, and I remember even among children in a public school, there were kids sticking things on their lockers saying the pill is a no-no, and it was a caricature that was being presented in popular culture, but that was nothing, of course, compared to the tsunami that was building within the church itself, the tsunami of dissent. I was raised in a beautiful Catholic home and family, never questioned my Catholic faith, but was ill-prepared growing up in those years to really articulate my faith well and to explain and defend my faith and why it was reasonable to accept what Pope Paul VI was teaching in Humanae Vitae. And yet, it remained, I think, until the pontificate of St. John Paul II to give us a language that was adequate and a framework that was adequate to proclaim with confidence the wisdom and truth that Blessed Pope Paul VI proclaimed in Humanae Vitae. John Paul VI gave us the beautiful language John Paul II gave us the beautiful language of personalism. And one of the things that he often would refer to was the law of the gift, giving us a beautiful appreciation of an adequate anthropology that could really sustain such a teaching. We are created in the image, in the likeness of God. Who is God? God is love. What is love? Love is making a gift of oneself, giving oneself, emptying oneself, pouring out oneself. This was the basis upon which John Paul II was able to teach and proclaim the unique beauty of man and woman, the complementarity of the sexes, and to build this beautiful structure that came to be known as the theology of the body, that series of catechetical teachings that he gave at the beginning of his pontificate. This is still being unpacked. This is still being presented. We don't speak today, as has already been said, in the language that Pope Paul VI used in proclaiming Humanae Vitae, the language of natural law. That's not that it's not true, no longer true, but it's a language that people simply do not grasp. But they can grasp that beautiful language that St. John Paul II used so beautifully, so adequately, so fruitfully in proclaiming the Church's teaching, giving it a new luster, a new credibility, and a new ability to touch hearts. So this is what strikes me about the timeliness of this anniversary of Humanae Vitae. It has lost none of its truth, obviously. When I reread Humanae Vitae 50 years later, the thing that really strikes me is the prophetic truth of that dystopian vision that Paul VI gives us at the end of that document, a warning, if you will, truly a prophetic warning, what might happen should this teaching be forgotten, neglected, rejected, abandoned. And we have seen it. It's already been mentioned how Paul VI, 50 years ago, spoke of what might happen in the way women are mistreated, undervalued in society. We saw it very painfully in the recent #MeToo movement, but many other ways in which we have seen how there is such discord and disharmony between men and women, and within marriages, and the confusion over such things as gender, and what constitutes marriage, what constitutes man and woman. All of these things are, if you will, contained in the wisdom of Humanae Vitae, but they need to be continually renewed and represented in language that will be credible and compelling to people of our day, our generation.
Thank you. I'm going to take a step back, and I realize I didn't introduce myself. I'm Kathryn Lopez from National Review Magazine and the National Review Institute, and one of the things that I do is cover the culture, and I so agree with so much of what the bishops have said, and a point that Helen Alvarez made earlier about there's something good in this hashtag culture where people do want to belong to something, and people are so hungry to belong to something that seems good. And I was even trying to see in New York City on Fifth Avenue, literally every store in the month of June had rainbow something, you know, and even there's a longing for something, to feel like, you know, we belong to something good and revolutionary. And anyhow, talking about Paul VI, in 2012, it was the Year of Faith. And two weeks before the Mass at the Vatican, I got a phone call from a priest from New Jersey who works in the Vatican in the new evangelization office, and he said, "Please don't hang up the phone when I say what I'm about to say." At which point he better have been saying one thing, and it was, "I'm calling on behalf of the Holy Father. Finally, I can be famous with my mother. She'll, you know, I've achieved something." But what he was calling about was at the beginning of it was the 50-year mark of the opening of the Vatican Council at that point. And Pope Benedict had the idea that these messages to different peoples in different walks of life that Paul VI had issued at the closing of the council be reissued. And so one of them was to women, and they thought an American journalist would be a good person to give a message to women. And so I read it, I think, for the first time, or it stuck for the first time, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. But part of the language from Paul VI is that at this moment when the human race is undergoing so deep a transformation, women impregnated with the spirit of the gospel can do so much to aid mankind in not falling. And then it closes saying, "Women of the entire universe, whether Christian or non-believing, you to whom life is entrusted at this grave moment in history, it is for you to save the peace of the world." And I often read those two lines in particular, especially in ecumenical audiences or to college students, and say, "Oh, by the way, that's what the Catholic Church thinks about women." And I thought when Pope Benedict had this, as I understand it was his idea to reissue them, it was sort of a profound statement, like, we didn't fully communicate this as a church, and the world certainly didn't hear it. I mean, most people have no idea that the Catholic Church thinks that about women. And Bishop Morlino has that no comeback line about practicing contraception your entire life. But that is real, and that's real both in the church. That's pushback you get both in the church and from outside the church. How can we better communicate these things, and how to is there a changing role for bishops in all of this? Because one of the frustrating things is somebody who covers these things and sees there seem to be so many opportunities. These issues of family and life and love and marriage come up almost in everything. Anthony Kennedy resigns, even in the boys in Thailand in the mine, there's this is longing for hope and goodness, and people feeling this terrible trauma in the immigration issue at the thought that families be separated. There's a good there that we can speak into, right? They see mom, dad, child, good, right? Even in all the confusion. So how do we communicate it as a church better? And I think I'm going to make you start again, Bishop Freyer, if you don't mind. And are there changing roles for bishops, or who should be communicating this best in this landscape right now?
Great questions, a number of questions, Kathryn, so I'll try to hit a couple of them.
But we do have a few minutes.
Okay, great. The situation in Thailand with those boys in the cave, the hope that those boys would be rescued was intimately tied to life. A mother who conceives a child hopes for that life to be born with good health. That I think hope and life are intricately entwined. We don't always communicate that as well. The family separation issue as well. That there's a hope that a child would be able to be in his mother's arms or her mother's arms at the end of the day. That when we start speaking positively about the gift of life and how life brings hope, that then people, I think, will tend to be more open to life. When we see societies that don't have hope, those are precisely the societies that have declining birth rates, that they can't imagine a future that is better than its own. They seem to be able to turn in on themselves and just throw in the towel. If we as bishops, and I think there is a change in role with bishops, we need to be out there in a unified voice, speaking messages that are positive, that are hopeful. I know at the June General Assembly, there was conversation about that we need to engage positive messages that will bring people about. The sledgehammer or just saying this is wrong isn't going to be helpful, but I think when we get those real life stories and we can infuse those stories with a positive message about life, a positive message about faith, a positive message about hope, and how they're all intertwined with community and with the power of God's love, then I think we've got a great starting point.
Bishop Lopes?
I think part of the contours of the challenge that we face is a media culture that definitely forms a narrative, and that's a deliberate act at that point. I think all of us have heard, as any faithful Catholic has heard, that the church, most Catholics, society, you fill in the subject, has rejected the church's teaching on contraception. We've all heard this, yes? Okay. Now think about if 98% of this room hasn't read Humanae Vitae. Blow that out to your parishes, and how many people do you think there have never read Humanae Vitae? All of them have, So most people have never heard the church's teaching on contraception. So what they're rejecting is a caricature. And who's putting the caricature out? People with a vested interest in a certain thing. They've never heard, as Bishop Morlino said, the beauty of this teaching. They never heard it expressed perhaps in the terms of, the dignity of woman and the respect among spouses and giving place to her and, respecting the fact that she has a body that God gave her and it's not yours to manipulate or control or, abuse in any sort of way. None of this has informed any part of the conversation. So in a certain sense, we have to take back ground. And you can do that positively, you can do that beautifully. Benedict XVI, I agree with Helen Alvarez this morning, Deus Caritas Est, his first encyclical, is a groundbreaking document in so very many ways. But the thing that he does in the first chapter is he sets out deliberately to reclaim the word eros and erotic as not something dirty, but as something holy, and as something expressive of the nature of God himself, in which we share as being created in his image and likeness. And so it's a wonderful way of, it's our source of creativity, our source of strength, the foundation of community. You know, without erotic love, as it turns out, humanity would have died out centuries ago. So it's not a bad thing. See, it's that reclaiming a sense. It's the same thing here. Reclaiming a beauty and a truth about the human person, and about the person as being in relationship and what that means, and being, again, to being able to express that. Now, how you express that in the current media-dominated culture, you know, that's what we have experts for, but we have to pay attention to them, that there is a need. We heard it this morning, both speakers this morning. You cannot just keep saying the unitive and procreative ends of marriage. How do you say that which is true in a way that could actually be heard? An attorney friend of mine, I remember when we were having the whole Prop 8 thing here in California, you know, says, you know, the problem with our side is the other side just has to say, it's a human rights issue. And then we come along and we have to say, well, what a human person is, what a right is, what a human right is. And eventually, a page and a half later, we get to, you see, we're beaten at a linguistic game. We have to know that it's a game and that we need to play it better.
Bishop Morlino.
I couldn't agree more with Bishop Lopes on that one. The framing of the question, the language, when people start to fool with language, we can almost be certain that some no good, something pernicious is beneath the surface when people start fooling with language. I think to myself, what can the bishop do? Well, the bishop, first of all, can reflect on the fact, and it's widely known, of the many, many suicides that occur in our culture. Seems to be a growing number. Now, if somebody is prepared to commit suicide, they're probably not prepared to bring forth new life in marriage. Life has become so meaningless for them that the last thing they'd want to do is give it to somebody else. It's become a disease for them. And this is so widely recognized that there's even a special coming up, or maybe it just happened, on CNN about suicide. Now, if CNN is doing a special on suicide, I'd have to predict that their conclusion is that President Trump should commit suicide. I can't see where else they would go. But anyway, they're presenting it as something very, very serious. And I think we need to reflect on that as bishops. And then, of course, this also raises the question of public policy. Public policy when it comes to abortion, especially when it comes to assisted suicide and all these sorts of things. That mission is a mission primarily for lay people. To affect public policy is for lay people. And a beautifully married couple, just by the way they go about their lives. When I go into the home where a beautiful marriage resides, the message about life is much more powerful than anything that I could say. And thank God it happens more and more and more. As I look out at my Sunday stational Mass, there are more and more and more families there that take up a whole pew. It's amazing. Well, that joy in life, that respect for life, really should be proclaimed, I think, first and foremost by the lay people, who then can also have their effect in the political domain and turn public policy toward life rather than against it. One of the big problems that we face is that public policy is against life. And that's why the Supreme Court appointment has so much hope for us. But we need a turning of public policy, and we saw that the 4 priests from Montana went to a Trump rally and they got in trouble. It's for the lay people. It's for the lay people. And I think what the bishops can do most is help form the lay people to do it and encourage them strongly that the political sphere is a very high form of life. It doesn't have to be the corrupt, lying politician that we all make jokes about. It can be the highest form of lay mission in the church. And I think the bishops need to see to it that people are formed that way, and to take every opportunity, like right now we have so many gifted people, to exhort you, to encourage you, to say God wants you to get into this.
Bishop Coakley, Archbishop Coakley.
The wise steward in the scripture takes from the storehouse things both old and new and presents them. Looking back over the course of the last 50, 60 years, I think one of the things that the Second Vatican Council taught, that maybe the very heart of the Second Vatican Council, can be found in the 5th chapter of Lumen Gentium, the dogmatic constitution on the Church, which is the call to holiness, the universal call to holiness, the reminder, nothing new, but something that needed to be lifted up again for our time, that all of us are called to holiness, that all of us are called to be saints. That's our vocation, all of us, virtue of the fact that we have been baptized. And there is a beauty in holiness, a power in holiness. The saints are attractive, men and women. So one of the things that I think that we really need to focus on, perhaps as bishops and as pastors, as parents, all of us, is recognizing that sublime vocation that is ours. Which really highlights the dignity of the human person and the dignity of what we are called to, what it means to be a husband or a wife, what it means to be a spouse, what it means to be a pastor and a shepherd. John Paul II, St. John Paul II, understood this, and for that reason beatified and canonized more men and women from every walk of life than I think any or all of his predecessors combined, I think I've heard. But he understood the need for Christian witnesses. It is the witness of holiness, the witness of a life lived with integrity and joy and faith and hope and love. That is what is going to touch hearts. That is what is going to draw people. That is what is going to have an impact in our society and in our culture, which really points to the bishop's role as evangelist. We are called to proclaim this and to lift this up, the call to holiness, and to show by pointing to authentic Christian witnesses that holiness is possible. And I think all of us who are pastors can look about our parishes, our dioceses, and recognize those witnesses in our midst, those generous, loving, joyful families in particular who welcome life, who affirm life, who share life, who give life. As an aside, this last year in the Archdiocese of Oklahoma City, we were able to celebrate the beatification of someone, a pastor in this case, who gave his life, the first American martyr in Blessed Stanley Rother, who knew that his life was in jeopardy, but who loved his people. He loved them with a Christ-like love. And when he knew that his name was on a death list, he chose to stay. He chose to return, and he chose to lay down his life. That was such a powerful event in the life of our local church, to celebrate a beatification, to celebrate a parish priest that his brother and sister are still alive and they were still present, but to have that kind of living flesh and blood witness to holiness, it has been a tremendous source of grace and renewal in our local church, and indeed I think far beyond our local church. Our first American martyr, our first U.S. born priest to be beatified. This is what I think we need to highlight and to lift up the dignity of the human person, the call to holiness in every vocation. It's not the unique domain of priests or bishops or religious. Married couples, men and women, mothers and fathers, that's your vocation. And if we can form parents with an appreciation of that dignity of their call to holiness, to lay down their lives, to live that law of the gift for one another, with one another, for their children, I think that will be a tremendous gift to the whole church.
One of the greatest gifts I think we have right now that we often miss the opportunity of is Pope Francis, and the fact that whatever the discussions people are having internally about footnotes and things that are important theological questions, obviously, people are taking a second look at the church. And, you know, I know curmudgeonly conservatives who I love dearly and are all a part of my lives who say, oh, you know what, Pope Benedict kissed babies too? Well, they're paying attention now. Let's run with this. And I say that because this conference is so encouraging. You know, Lisa Wheeler, who moderates the movies every night at the Napa Institute, like every year. I've known her for a decade. I didn't know she was a foster parent. The most important thing about her is that she's a foster parent, an adoptive parent. And there are so many stories like that. We have Mary Rose and Ryan Verrett from Witness to Love here as well, who have a marriage mentoring program. And if we had more time, but we only have 3 minutes, and John Mayer's about to cut us off, I'm sure each bishop here could tell stories about some of the married couples in their pastoral care. If there's one thing that we can do from this conference, I think it's start telling these stories differently. The fact that Cana Voss exists is a great blessing, that Mary Hassan and Helen Alvarez exist. And I think you'll all join me in thanking each of these bishops for helping encourage us, because we have this great richness. And I think we all want to work together more effectively, collaboratively, and guided by the Holy Spirit in this time of great opportunity as well as challenge. So thank you, everyone. Thank you to each of the bishops.
Thank you. And thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thank you, God.